It was supposed to be just another daytime interview, comfortable, predictable, carefully managed. But in a matter of seconds, the tone shifted. A simple question turned into something sharper. The kind of moment where you can actually feel the air in the room change. And right there, on live television, Jennifer Lawrence stopped playing along. Before we break down what really happened in that tense exchange, make sure you subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below, because moments like this don't just entertain. They reveal what's really happening behind the polished world of celebrity interviews. This wasn't a scripted confrontation. It wasn't edited for dramatic effect. It unfolded in real time, in front of a live audience, with no opportunity to rewind, rephrase, or take anything back. And that's exactly why it still gets talked about. Jennifer Lawrence had already built a reputation for being refreshingly honest. She wasn't the kind of celebrity who stuck to rehearsed answers or carefully crafted public statements. From the beginning of her rise in Hollywood, she stood out not just for her performances, but for how she carried herself in interviews. Unfiltered, direct, sometimes even unpredictable. But that same authenticity had also made her a target. Media coverage around her had grown increasingly critical in the months leading up to that interview. Headlines picked apart her comments. Interviews were dissected frame by frame. And what once felt like charm started being reframed as something else entirely. There was a shift in tone, subtle at first, then more noticeable. The narrative around Jennifer Lawrence was changing. At the same time, Whoopi Goldberg had long been known as one of the most experienced and respected voices in daytime television. As a co-host on The View, she wasn't just another interviewer reading questions off a card. She had decades of experience navigating difficult conversations, challenging guests, and addressing controversial topics head-on. The View itself wasn't designed to be a comfortable space for celebrities. It was a show built on opinions, debates, and real-time reactions. Unlike late-night interviews that leaned toward humor and promotion, this was a platform where public perception could shift in a single segment. And that's what made this particular appearance different from the start. Jennifer Lawrence wasn't walking into a controlled environment. She was stepping into a space where questions weren't always predictable and where the conversation could turn at any moment. In the days leading up to the interview, there had already been a growing conversation about celebrity behavior and media responsibility. Interviews across different shows had started to feel more pointed. Less about promotion, more about accountability. And Jennifer Lawrence, whether intentionally or not, had found herself at the center of that shift. The stage was set long before she walked out. When she finally appeared on The View, everything seemed normal at first. The audience applauded. The introductions were warm. Smiles were exchanged. On the surface, it looked like every other daytime TV segment viewers had seen hundreds of times before. But underneath that surface, there was tension. Not the obvious kind. Not something you could immediately point to. It was quieter than that. Subtle. The kind of tension that builds when both sides know there's more to talk about than what's being said out loud. Whoopi Goldberg, sitting at the table, wasn't just there to keep things light. She had a role to play, a responsibility to ask questions that mattered. And Jennifer Lawrence, whether she expected it or not, was about to be placed in a position where staying neutral wasn't going to be an option. What makes this moment so important isn't just what was said, it's when and how it happened. Live television removes the safety net. There are no second takes. No edits. No way to reshape the narrative after the fact. Every pause, every reaction, every word lands exactly as it is. And when something unexpected happens, it doesn't just stay in the studio, it spreads instantly. That's exactly what happened here. Because this wasn't just about one question. It was about timing, context, and a growing tension between how celebrities are portrayed and how they respond to that portrayal. Jennifer Lawrence had spent years navigating that balance between being herself and being interpreted by millions of viewers. But in that moment, something shifted. The line between interview and confrontation blurred. And Whoopi Goldberg, with her experience and direct style, wasn't going to let the moment pass quietly. As the conversation moved forward, the tone began to change. Slowly at first, almost unnoticeable. A slight shift in phrasing. A pause that lasted just a second longer than expected. A look exchange that hinted something deeper was coming. The audience didn't fully realize it yet, but they were about to witness a moment that would redefine the entire interview. Because sometimes, all it takes is one question asked at exactly the right time to turn a routine conversation into something much more revealing. And when that question finally came, there was no going back. By the time Jennifer Lawrence walked onto that stage, her public image had already gone through a noticeable transformation, one that didn't happen overnight, but slowly, through repetition, headlines, and shifting media narratives. Early in her career, she had been widely embraced as something different. In an industry known for polished responses and carefully managed personalities, she came across as spontaneous. She laughed at awkward moments. She admitted when she didn't know something. She didn't try to present herself as flawless. For audiences, that felt real. But over time, that same authenticity started to be interpreted in a different light. Clips from interviews were replayed across platforms. Certain moments, sometimes jokes, sometimes offhand remarks, were isolated and analyzed. Conversations about her began to focus less on her work and more on her personality. Was she being genuine? Was it an act? Was the relatable image becoming overexposed? These weren't questions coming directly from her. They were being shaped around her. And once a narrative like that begins, it tends to build on itself. At the same time, the media environment itself was evolving. Interviews were no longer just about promoting a film or discussing a role. They had become part of a larger cycle, one where every answer could become a headline, every reaction a talking point. Talk shows, in particular, were no longer just platforms for conversation. They were part of that cycle. The View stood at the center of that shift. Unlike traditional late-night shows, The View operated differently. It wasn't built around scripted monologues or comedic segments. It was driven by discussion, real-time opinions, reactions to current events, cultural trends, and public figures. And because of that, the tone could shift quickly from light-hearted to serious, from supportive to critical. At the table sat voices with strong perspectives, and among them, Whoopi Goldberg brought a particular kind of authority. She had spent decades navigating both entertainment and public discourse. She wasn't known for being confrontational in a dramatic sense, but she was known for being direct. When she asked a question, it carried weight. And that's where the context becomes important. In the months leading up to Jennifer Lawrence's appearance, discussions about celebrity behavior had become more pointed across multiple platforms. There was a growing emphasis on accountability, on how public figures presented themselves, on whether authenticity was real or curated. Jennifer Lawrence, because of her visibility in past interviews, was often included in those conversations, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. Segments on shows like The View would touch on broader topics, but viewers could connect the dots. They could see who those conversations were about, even if names weren't always mentioned. And when a celebrity steps into that space, they are not just entering a neutral environment. They are entering a conversation that's already in progress. That's what made this particular interview feel different before it even began. It wasn't just about promoting a project. It wasn't just about answering standard questions. There was already a layer of expectation on both sides. For the hosts, there was an opportunity to address a topic that had been circulating. For Jennifer Lawrence, there was an unspoken awareness of how she had been portrayed. Neither side needed to say it out loud. It was already there. As the segment approached, everything followed the usual structure. The introduction, the applause, the opening remarks. On the surface, it was exactly what viewers expected from a daytime talk show appearance. But small details began to stand out. The pacing of the conversation felt slightly more measured. The questions, while still conversational, carried a different tone, less casual, more deliberate. And Jennifer Lawrence, known for her relaxed interview style, seemed just a bit more focused in her responses. Not guarded but aware. That awareness matters. Because when someone knows they might be stepping into a sensitive topic, their approach changes. They listen more closely. They choose their words more carefully. They pay attention not just to what's being asked, but how it's being asked. And that's exactly what was happening here. Whoopi Goldberg, sitting across from her, maintained the same composed presence she always brought to the table. But there was a subtle shift in the rhythm of the conversation. A sense that it was moving towards something not abruptly, but gradually. The audience, for the most part, remained relaxed. From their perspective, it was still a normal interview. Laughter came at the expected moments. Applause followed familiar cues. But beneath that, the direction of the conversation was becoming clearer. This wasn't going to stay light. Because the topics surrounding Jennifer Lawrence at that time weren't light. They involved perception, media framing, and the balance between public personality and personal reality. And those aren't subjects that can be fully addressed with quick, surface-level answers. They require something more direct. And that's where the pressure begins to build. The shift didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, a transition from general questions into more specific territory, from safe topics into ones that carried more weight. And as that transition unfolded, the space between question and answer started to feel just a little longer. Just enough for the audience to notice. Just enough for the moment to begin forming. Because sometimes, the most defining moments in live television aren't the loud ones. They are the quiet shifts, the subtle changes in tone that signal something bigger is about to happen. And in this case, everything was leading to a single point. A question that wouldn't feel like just another question. A response that wouldn't sound like just another answer. And once that line was crossed, the interview wouldn't be the same again. The moment didn't arrive with a dramatic interruption or a raised voice. It came quietly, almost seamlessly woven into the flow of conversation. That's what made it so easy to miss at first and so impossible to ignore once it landed. Up until that point, the exchange had followed a familiar rhythm. Questions, answers, light reactions from the audience. But then the tone shifted subtly, but clearly. Whoopi Goldberg leaned slightly forward. Not abruptly. Not in a way that would immediately signal tension. But enough to indicate focus. Her expression remained composed, measured, the same calm presence viewers had come to expect. And then she asked a question that carried more weight than anything that had come before it. It wasn't framed as an accusation. It wasn't confrontational in delivery. But it touched on something that had been building outside that studio for months, the way Jennifer Lawrence had been perceived in interviews, and how those perceptions had been discussed across media platforms. For a brief moment, everything paused. Not in a dramatic, extended silence, but in that split second where a person decides how to respond. The kind of pause that only becomes noticeable because of what follows it. Jennifer Lawrence didn't immediately answer. Her posture shifted slightly. Shoulders adjusting, not defensively, but with awareness. Her expression remained neutral at first, but her eyes focused more intently, no longer scanning the room, no longer playing to the audience. She was locked into the question. And then she responded. Her tone wasn't raised. It wasn't aggressive. But it was firmer than anything she had said earlier in the interview. The kind of firmness that signals a boundary, not dramatic, not emotional, but deliberate. She addressed the question directly. Not with a deflection, not with humor, but with clarity. There was a noticeable difference in pacing. Her words came more carefully now, each one placed with intention. She acknowledged the broader conversation surrounding her, how certain moments had been interpreted, how narratives had formed. But there was something else in her response, a subtle shift from participation to control. She wasn't just answering anymore. She was reframing. As she spoke, the energy in the room changed. The audience, which had been reacting naturally throughout the segment, grew quieter. Not completely silent, but more attentive. Less reactive. More focused on the exchange itself. Across from her, Whoopi Goldberg listened without interruption. That in itself stood out. In many interviews, especially on panel shows, responses are often met with follow-ups, reactions, or immediate commentary. But here, there was space. A deliberate pause that allowed Jennifer Lawrence to finish her point fully. And when she did, there was another brief silence. This one slightly longer. Whoopi's expression remained composed, but there was a subtle shift and acknowledgement that the tone of the conversation had changed. She responded, not defensively, but with a measured follow-up. Clarifying. Expanding. Keeping the discussion grounded, but not retreating from it. What followed wasn't an argument. It wasn't a heated exchange. It was something more controlled and in some ways, more revealing. A back and forth that stayed calm on the surface, but carried tension underneath. Each response carefully delivered. Each word chosen with awareness of the audience, the cameras, and the fact that this was happening live. Jennifer Lawrence maintained that same steady tone. She didn't escalate. She didn't withdraw. She stayed present in the conversation, but on her own terms. That's what made the moment stand out. Because in live television, especially in environments designed for discussion, guests often adapt to the tone set by the host. They follow the rhythm. They respond within the structure. But here, that structure shifted. Not dramatically, but enough to be felt. The balance of the conversation adjusted. It was no longer just the host guiding the discussion. It had become something more equal, more direct, and the audience could sense it. There were fewer interruptions, less background reaction. Even the usual cues, laughter, applause, felt more restrained. It wasn't discomfort in the traditional sense. It was attentiveness, a recognition that this wasn't just another segment. This was a moment unfolding in real time. Cameras continued to roll. No cuts. No edits. Every expression, every pause, every shift in tone captured exactly as it happened. And that's what gave the exchange its weight. Because nothing could be adjusted afterward. There was no opportunity to soften a response or reframe a question. What viewers saw in that moment was exactly what occurred, unfiltered, uninterrupted, and immediate. As the conversation began to move forward again, the tone didn't fully return to what it had been before. It couldn't. Something had changed. Not in a dramatic or explosive way, but in a way that lingered. Jennifer Lawrence leaned back slightly, her posture relaxing just a bit, but her expression remained focused. Whoopi Goldberg transitioned the conversation forward, guiding it towards safer ground, but with the awareness that what had just happened wouldn't go unnoticed. The segment continued, but the moment stayed. And for viewers watching live, it became the part they remembered, not because it was loud or chaotic, but because it was real. A brief exchange, a shift in tone, a question that led to an answer neither side could take back. And once it aired, it didn't stay confined to that studio. Because live television has a way of turning small moments into lasting ones. And this was one of them. For a few seconds after the exchange ended, the studio didn't react the way it usually would. There was no immediate laughter to reset the tone. No quick applause to smooth things over. Just a brief, noticeable pause, one that lingered long enough for everyone in the room to register that something had shifted. The audience, which had been engaged and responsive throughout the segment, now felt more restrained. Not uncomfortable in an obvious way, but quieter. More observant. As if they were processing what they had just witnessed rather than reacting to it. Across the table, Whoopi Goldberg maintained her composure. That was part of her strength as a host, keeping control of the conversation, even when it moved into unexpected territory. She didn't rush to fill the silence, and she didn't dismiss what had just been said. Instead, she allowed the moment to settle before guiding the discussion forward. It was a subtle but important choice. Because in live television, how a host responds after a tense exchange can define how the audience interprets it. A quick deflection might have minimized the moment. A sharp rebuttal could have escalated it. But what happened instead was measured, controlled, intentional. The conversation continued, but it didn't return to its original tone. There was a noticeable difference now. The pacing felt slightly more careful. The questions that followed were lighter, but the energy remained grounded. It was as if both sides understood that the dynamic had changed and that the rest of the segment would carry that awareness. Jennifer Lawrence, for her part, remained composed. She didn't appear shaken or defensive. If anything, she seemed more focused. Her responses stayed steady, her tone consistent. But there was a clarity in her presence now that hadn't been there at the beginning of the interview. She had addressed something directly, in real time, without stepping outside the bounds of the conversation. And that mattered. Because moments like this don't just exist in isolation. They become part of a larger narrative, one that continues after the cameras stop rolling. As the segment came to an end, the audience responded with applause, but it felt different from the opening. Less automatic, more deliberate. Not just a reaction to a performance, but an acknowledgement of what they had just seen. Backstage, the shift would have been even more apparent. Live television moves quickly. Segments transition, schedules continue, and the production doesn't pause for reflection. But within that fast-moving environment, moments like this stand out. They get noticed not just by viewers, but by producers, networks, and media outlets watching closely. And once the clip began to circulate beyond the live broadcast, the reaction expanded. Viewers replayed the exchange. Not for shock value, but for clarity. To understand the tone, the wording, the subtle details that are easy to miss in real time. Online discussions focused on the balance of the conversation, how the question was asked, how it was answered, and what it revealed about both sides. Some saw it as a rare example of a celebrity pushing back calmly, without confrontation, but with intention. Others focused on the role of the host, noting how the conversation was handled without losing control of the format. What made the moment resonate wasn't conflict. It was honesty. In an environment where interviews are often predictable, where answers can feel rehearsed and questions carefully managed, this stood out as something different. It wasn't dramatic in the traditional sense. It didn't rely on raised voices or sharp exchanges. It relied on presence, on timing, on the willingness to address something directly, in a space where that doesn't always happen. For Jennifer Lawrence, the impact was subtle but meaningful. This wasn't a moment that redefined her career or dramatically altered public perception overnight. But it added something to her public image, a reinforcement of the qualities she had been known for early on. Directness, awareness, the ability to engage without losing control of her own narrative. At a time when media narratives around her had become more complex, this moment offered a counterpoint. Not through statements or headlines, but through a live interaction that viewers could interpret for themselves. For Whoopi Goldberg, it reinforced something equally important. Her role wasn't just to host, it was to navigate conversations that could shift in unexpected ways. And in this case, she did exactly that. She asked a question that carried weight, listened to the response, and maintained the balance of the discussion without escalating it. That balance is what allowed the moment to exist as it did. Not as a conflict, but as an exchange. And that distinction is why it still matters. Because live television rarely offers moments that feel entirely unscripted yet fully controlled at the same time. There's usually a clear direction, a defined tone. But every so often, something breaks through that structure, not by disrupting it, but by revealing what's underneath. That's what this was. A brief window into how public figures and media platforms interact when the conversation becomes real. And years later, it still stands as an example of how much can be communicated without raising a voice, without stepping outside professionalism, and without losing composure. It reminds viewers that not every impactful moment needs to be loud to be lasting. Sometimes, the quiet ones stay with us longer. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to subscribe to Prime Talk, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because moments like this aren't just part of entertainment, they are part of a bigger conversation about media, perception, and the people at the center of it.